Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. Good evening, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and welcome to tonight's contemporary science program, Brain Map, How the Brain Orchestrates Movement. It's our great honor to have two distinguished scientists this evening to explain a priority area of brain research, ordinary movement, motion that seems easy, but in fact is very complicated. Tamar Flash is the Dr. Hymie Moross Professor of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. Dr. Flash is a specialist in computational neuroscience, the study of mathematical patterns that characterize brain activity. Her focus is on the neural representation of human arm movements and the application of those patterns to both medical rehabilitation and advanced robotics. In projects funded by the U.S. Navy and DARPA, she's also worked on the neural patterns of octopus arm movements for application to underwater robotic systems as well as above water. Dr. Emilio Bizzi is an MIT Institute professor and investigator at McGovern Institute for Brain Research and Eugene McDermott Professor of the Brain Sciences and Human Behavior at MIT. He served as director of the Whitaker College of Health Sciences and Technology from 1983 to 1989 and chaired the MIT Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences from 1986 to 1997. In 2001, he was appointed investigator at the McGovern Institute. Dr. Bizzi is a world leader in the investigation of brain control of complex movement. His research targets the conversion of mental intentions into the detailed commands needed to control muscle contractions and limb movements. One of his key discoveries is that groups of muscles are activated synergistically by circuits of neurons in the spinal cord. He's found that these synergies represent fundamental building blocks for assembling a repertoire of complex movements. Dr. Bizzi's discoveries represent a major contribution to understanding how motor control is affected by stroke damage and how computational analysis of motor control can be harnessed to improve rehabilitation methods for stroke patients. It is a very great honor to welcome Dr. Tamar Flash and Dr. Emilio Bizzi. In general, the last thing we think about is movement because it seems perfectly easy to us, but apparently even the simplest movements are very complicated. Could you begin by just giving us a general overview of this complexity?
Sure. Well, let's say that I want to pick up a pair of glasses, something that I do thousands of times per week or per day. Anyway, the first thing to do is to make sure that I understand where these glasses are with respect to me. And the information that tells me something about the position of this pair of glasses is conveyed by the optic fibers to a part of the brain which is on the back of the head. Okay, and this is the region that back there. It's called the occipital lobe of the cortex, and it is a visual analyzer. This region will process the information from the retina and will essentially make an image of these glasses at this level. Then, of course, the information has to be conveyed from the visual areas that are at the back of the brain. The information will travel through long fibers to this area in green, which is here, and this is the motor cortex. Okay. At this point, what are the computations that essentially have to be done by the brain? Well, the brain acts through the activation of cells. These cells, all they can do is to fire signals. And these signals ultimately, as you can see from this picture here, this arrow keeps disappearing, but here it is. You see these long pathways will go down to an area called the brainstem, and then down to the spinal cord. And this complex circuitry from the occipital cortex to the motor cortex is one of the many lines of activity that occur in the brain in order to move the limbs to the proper target. And there are many other circuits that connect some other areas of the brain, the cerebellum, which is this area here, connected to the cortex. And this area is important because it provides memory traces, and it provides also a circuitry that will improve the performance of the movement. Now, there are many other areas which are important, and this is the area of the basal ganglia, which is now in this picture. It's this big area here. This area is a site which is very connected to the motor cortex, and this is an area that has to do with memory, motor memories, has to do with habits. The habits are the pattern of activity that is necessary to implement and express habits is located in this area. Okay, so this is just a very brief, very brief outline of the complexities that the brain has to do for the simple act of picking up an object.
Right,
Okay.
and it makes it look so easy.
It makes it easy. It is easy because, to a certain extent, we have done this over and over again. That means that each of our daily movements is encoded in memory.
Yes.
And so the program that specifies all the activity for the muscles is embedded into the circuitry
Right.
of particularly the motor cortex. And in fact, if there is a damage to the cortex due to somebody hitting on your head right on the motor cortex or a stroke, then the memories are gone.
Yes.
And there are profound deficits in the activity of the brain.
Great. So we're
Yeah.
going to hear about
Yeah.
that shortly
Yeah.
and understand that a lot better. Then fine. So now we have a general kind of a picture of this, and then there are sort of hierarchies of representation, right? So this brain plan.
Okay, so we have to ask, that's what we are doing as researchers.
Yeah.
We are asking what kind of information is represented in the different areas of the motor system, namely in all these areas that Professor Bizzi has talked about, and how are movement represented. And of course, if we are moving our hand towards the glasses, we can encode or code the information about movement in terms of what the hand is doing,
Yeah.
for example, in external world. And that would be the object level, because this is the
Okay.
level that we operate in the external world. But of course, when I move my hand in space, I can do it in many different ways. So
Yes.
I can move it with my shoulder
Yes.
up or down. I can do different movements with the
Right.
joints. And therefore, the brain has to transform this motion of the hand in space to the motions of the different joints.
Okay.
So this is the joint level that is probably represented, but we are not clear where it is represented.
Oh.
Okay, because that's one of the questions. Do
Yeah.
we have all these different levels represented, or are they all information intermingled together?
I see.
So the next thing is the muscle, because of course to move the joints and eventually the hand, we have to contract the muscles appropriately. And there are many more muscles than are really needed. That's actually what Leonardo has realized even in his writing, that there are many more more muscle than the mechanics is requiring for. So the question is, how do we activate the right muscles to each individual movement, and how do we keep memory of this muscle activation at the brain? So actually, one of the main problem in studying the hierarchy of motor systems is this huge redundancy.
Yeah.
Because we have many, many different ways to do any movement or to activate many muscles. And so the question is, how does the brain select what to do to really move the hand and to move the joints and to activate the muscles?
Right, and instantaneously, it seems.
Instantaneously,
right,
even though it doesn't happen instantaneously,
Right.
because there is what we usually need is reaction time that takes about 300 milliseconds.
Right, but it seems instant.
Between the time we see something and the time we actually start moving.
Yeah.
So the brain is doing something in the middle, but we are investigating what.
I see, okay. So then if we have this much out of the way, then it's to understand how it's so smooth, correct? And is this where this notion of compositionality and synergies, does that come in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Terms we are not familiar with.
So there, the machinery of the brain tries to make the movement smooth.
Yeah.
And there are many good reasons to do that, because you don't want to have jerky movements that would strain and produce damage to the tendons or to the muscles themselves. So the process of learning helps enormously to achieve a smooth transition from movement to movement and a smooth execution of movement. And this particular picture here on the left side represents a slide of the motor cortex in a newborn.
Ah.
Okay. And you can see here that the cells are already in the brain, they are in the cortex, but they are very poorly connected. Okay, and then after a few months, the number of cells increases here, and then at about a year and a half, the connectivity begins to appear. The connectivity of the cells represents the way in which the brain forms circuitry that represent essentially learning. So that's very important, and you can see that in the fully developed, still juvenile brain on the right side of this slide, the enormous amount of connectivity. Okay, that and then that connectivity continues throughout life. As you learn new things, you have to form new memories. New memories are formed by establishing connectivity between cells. There are billions of cells in our brain, and so we can continue to learn new things even at advanced age.
And so circuits like what athletes or dancers or musicians learn are developed from this sort of a system, but you also see why an age advantage there.
And in fact, if people through imaging have been able to see the brain of a violinist, and they have demonstrated through this imaging process that the area of the motor cortex is enlarged in the case of somebody that had to learn a very sophisticated and complex skill.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
So now then, as I said previously in the previous slide, the impulses from the cortex, which essentially is the area of learning, will go down to the commands.
Yeah.
The commands will go down through this pathway from the cortex to the spinal cord, which is, in this picture, is here. Okay? And you can see the termination of the fibers from the cortex in this particular area of the spinal cord. And this is an area that I have investigated extensively. And I've shown that there are group of cells that make a particular function, and that is they lump together a set of muscles. As Tamar said, there are lots and lots of muscles in our body, and one wonders, you know, the control. If you have a lot of things to control, it gets very complicated. So what, in order to be effective in movement, you have to simplify in some way this process of commanding the muscles. And so this particular area of the spinal cord will put together a group of muscles into a single block. And then what the cortical areas is doing a combination of blocks, and so movements are constructed by the signals that come from the cortex. They activate these areas in the spinal cord, which produce these blocks of muscles contraction. And these blocks are the synergies, and they represent sort of the building blocks. It's in this sense, the motor control is a little bit like the letter of the alphabet. In order to express a word, you put together
things,
but the same letters will go in different words. Well, the same thing happens in the motor control. The same blocks used in different combination will express different types of movement. And this is called the compositionality.
I see.
Okay?
And so that makes it much faster and smoother. That accounts for that,
That's
right? Because it's much speedier kind of a thing. Okay, so now we know what the compositionality and the synergies are. Now we have a kind of underlying geometry of this.
So one other thing that we can ask is, first of all, going back to the issue of hierarchy.
Yes.
So as we have said, you can do the same thing in many different ways. For example, when we look at handwriting, if we write, this is work from a pioneer in the study of motor control by the name of Nikolai Bernstein, who looked how he writes people wrote the word coordination in Russian one time when we hold the pen in our hand, and another time maybe if we stick the pen to our elbow. And what he found is that, or we move our leg.
Right.
And what he found is that even though the mechanics of the movement is very different when we do a small handwriting or we move a big leg, and the forces that are needed are very different, we still write the same kind of, in the same way. The path itself, the geometry of the movement, and the velocity when we write is very similar. So that means that the brain has this vocabulary of maybe alphabets that Professor Bizzi has talked at the level of muscle. This vocabulary also exists at the level of movement. It's not only at the level of muscles, but there is also a compositionality at the level of movement itself. So therefore, we have to ask what kind of principle we have to select which movement to put after which, and how, for example, to change the geometry of the movement, the path that we follow with our hand, and how to select the time or the velocity for each movement. So this thing has really led to extensive research in the area of motor control. And of course, if we think about, for example, how a conductor, I don't know if it would work, but how a conductor plays the music, I will skip that. It's also very complicated. So what we are doing in the study of motor control, we are looking for laws of motion. Can we describe the way we move using some kind of regularities? And for that purpose, we use even the language of mathematics. and we try to describe the movements, looking at the observation, the way we move, and then we can describe both the geometry of the movement and the timing. So even though if you look at a person, everybody seems to move in its different way, very idiosyncratically, we all move in a very similar way.
It's amazing, yeah.
So because it's like an alphabet, the words that we say are different, but the alphabet might be the same. So for example, when we move from one point to the other, we have this very nice smooth velocity profile that we talked about.
Yes.
And we can look at other kind of movement that we have looked at, for example, moving from one point to the other, or does it move? Oh, or for example, how do we do a curved movement? Okay, that's also
a curve like
this. Do we have just one velocity peak in the middle with maximum? Here we start from rest, get a higher velocity, and go back to rest. Keeps disappearing. Or if we do a curved movement, we have several peaks. You see, here velocity is higher, but we are much slower at the parts that are more curved during the movement. So when I'm moving along this part, I'm much slower in the more curved parts. And all of us doing it the same way.
Right.
So
regardless of our actual speed.
Regardless of our actual speed or how we move. Or for example, if we draw an ellipse, again, you slow down at the parts that are more curved. So there are all these regularities that we are using mathematics and modeling in order to describe them, and that's where the role of geometry comes into play.
Right. Is this a rather new area, or people have been at this, the geometry of the movement, for a long while?
Well, there are various attempts over the years to develop all kinds of models. For example, people are asking, are we moving in any optimal way, for example? So what is it that we optimize? Do we use the minimum energy we need, or do we have the fastest possible movements? Or, for example, we have developed a model that we move in the smoothest possible way. And all this optimization can be related also to the geometry of movement. And that's where we can ask what kind of geometry the brain does use to produce movement.
Yes, that's really very interesting that you keep bumping into geometry in nature no matter what.
I have a question for Tamar. Is the geometry Euclidean?
Oh, right.
Okay, so this is something that actually we have been studying in recent years, because in Euclidean geometry, if I'm moving along different paths, I can take the movements and rotate them and make them bigger. I would have the same kind of properties. That will be Euclidean geometry. But there are other kinds of non-Euclidean geometries that take into account other properties like angle, that they don't preserve angle, for example, or they don't preserve scale. There are a family of geometries that can play a role in the planning of movement.
May I ask, and do you know, in many discoveries in science, I'm thinking more like in physics, something new comes about, there's a new concept, and people need a new mathematics for it. You need to do something else. In terms of these geometries, these additional geometries, were they serving this kind of thing? Did they develop because there's a need for this kind of movement?
Actually, the idea of using geometry actually using different groups of transformation to describe different geometries was introduced by the Felix Klein, for example, already in the 19th century.
But did people pay attention?
And people have started using it in the field of vision research, for example, and saying, okay, if I have this object and this object is rotated, translated, shifted, how do I recognize that it's the same object, for example?
Okay, right.
So that's where you use geometry for vision. In the motor control area, I think it should be introduced. We have not started looking at it enough, but it should be introduced.
Yeah, there is one thing that in our brain, there is a geometrical geometry machine, but note that our limbs and our muscles have no relationship with any geometry, the muscles, and because the muscles are, if you have to move in a Euclidean space, whether I do this line here and this line here, okay, everything is...
it's complicated because there is no one-to-one mapping between the
See,
movements.
if I move this way or move this way,
Right.
the muscles, the activity is completely different. So
Uh-huh.
how do we get for our geometry, which is in our head, whatever
Yes,
it is,
right,
Euclidean or not
yeah.
Euclidean, to the implementation in muscle is complicated.
Okay. And also, how do we map movement? Because I think we think about moving in terms of something which is geometrical.
Exactly.
And
We
temporal. We think about
think
when
about
we
it.
wish to move, but we have to produce the right forces. And the geometry of
Right.
forces of dynamics is not the same as the geometry in the external world. So there is
it's not Euclidean, nothing to do with the
Right.
Euclidean
So
thing.
the question: how does the brain figure out what
How
forces?
does the brain figure out?
So does it?
That's a deep
Actually,
question.
it is, isn't
It's a deep
it?
question,
It's just-
and Tamar has contributed a lot
Yes.
to this problem.
Yes.
But also the question is that we have Newtonian mechanics.
Yes,
So
yes.
exactly. So how does the brain knows to solve the equation of motion which are requiring Newtonian mechanics?
Right.
So all these questions are really deep
Right.
questions that we don't have answers to yet.
And not only the human brain, but brains just in general. I suppose even much like reptiles, everything know how to move.
Oh yeah, exactly. Animals have to solve the same problems. Yeah.
Exactly.
A squirrel, a monkey, or a human,
Exactly.
they have the same
They're
problems.
rather good
Yeah.
at it.
And they're good.
They didn't know
Exactly.
that there was this geometry in there guiding that. And there are two major applications here to rehabilitation, to robotics that we want to get to. But perhaps we should start with what happens when this system breaks down.
Yeah. So there are a number of neurological disorders that affect the movement, and but perhaps the most dramatic disruptions of the motor system are the ones that are produced when there are clots or hemorrhages that damage the motor areas. Okay, so it depends on the extent of the damage, either the stroke or the hemorrhage, and you have various involvement of the brain, and you have a considerable amount of damage. Now, it's interesting that when I went to medical school, there were no treatment of a person that was affected by stroke, was left completely on its own. And in fact, you saw a lot of people that had the sequelae of the stroke and had particular type of posture, and they did not move. They barely moved the leg, but certainly the arm was severely impaired.
Right.
Then it was discovered that through feedback, that is, immediately after or soon after the stroke, if you apply first passive movements, by moving passively the limb, and then ask the person to do very simple movement and gradually increase the difficulty of this movement, there is a lot of feedback that comes from the limbs, and somehow this feedback, in conjunction with visual feedback and auditory feedback and so forth, will persuade cells that are still in the motor areas to become involved into commanding the limbs that has been affected by the stroke. So this is a process which is certainly not perfect, but there is, and it is the big problem is that it's very slow. It's very difficult through feedback and exercise and exercise and exercise, which should be aimed at a particular set of muscles, but this is done. But it is a slow process, which of course is costly because the person has to be guided, and also it takes a lot of patience and determination. But with patience, determination, and and a lot of practice, one can regain a certain amount of motility. And this is the essence of rehabilitation. Now, there are a number of other things that can be done that are partly experimental. There are a lot of now there are drugs that are used, and whether they work or they don't work remains to be seen. But in any case, there are lots of attempts to try to remedy this very crippling disease.
Exactly. Yeah. I have to ask if it seems as though stroke is generally more condition in the older population, generally.
Generally, the reason is that the stroke is a result of a vessel that is suddenly blocked.
Right.
Okay, so there is no blood going to a part of the brain, and that part of the brain, the cells die.
Right.
Okay. Now, why it happens in rarely in young people, but more frequently in older people?
Right.
Well, because they often there is a heart condition that whereby the blood doesn't move fluidly between the atrium and the ventricle, so it stagnates a little bit in the ventricle, and then there are clots that are formed, and the clots then can be shot up into the vessels, and then they block the circulation. Now, the hemorrhage is due to the fact that arteries can break down as a consequence of atherosclerotic processes that will weaken the arteries.
Yes, but it's really kind of encouraging that people, they're beginning to teach muscles in mature people. They're able to get some kind of motility back
they teach
in a number of cases.
The brain.
Exactly. Okay, but I mean, they can relearn. The cortex
can relearn.
The motor cortex can learn, because that was thought not to be possible for a long time. So that's very interesting. And I think you've done work, Tamar, on like Parkinson's.
So there could be other places that are affected by what we call movement disorders. For example, the part that you have seen before, which is the basal ganglia, which you have their memories for actions, or it's involved also in timing, it's involved in learning, also learning. So for example, if you have cell death in areas of the basal ganglia that is called substantia nigra, where you produce dopamine and cells are dying, so you don't have enough dopamine to activate the different parts of the basal ganglia, which are the putamen and the globus pallidus, and then you would get all kinds of deficits in movement disorders deficits, which include resting tremor, increased muscle tone, very rigid, very slowness. The main thing is really very slow movement, which is called bradykinesia, and there is shuffling of gait and freezing and loss of balance. But even though we know that the reason why we have this area of the part of the brain is affected because of lack of dopamine and cell death, we really don't fully understand what's the role of this particular area in movement control, how it's affecting movement. So.
And it's a complicated area, too.
And how is this movement, why are the movements so slow? Why people are losing balance, how it's talking with other parts of the brain, which is the motor cortex and the cerebellum. So what different labs are doing they are looking at the movements of Parkinson patients, and from the characteristics, disorders or impairments, they're trying to figure out or suggest how the brain or this particular part affects the control of movement.
Right. So they're looking at just beyond the dopamine thing. It's not like you can give an injection of dopamine and make it all better or anything like that. Then it's a very complex.
At the beginning, actually, dopa is given, which is a precursor of dopamine, but then after a while it becomes ineffective. And now there is this new technique of deep electrical stimulation of a particular area of the basal ganglia, and that seems promising.
Yes, this is but it's great information for you in general too. I mean, it's adding to what you
are trying to understand,
exactly
yeah.
to understand how the brain works, and so it can be a bit different with different disabilities
Sure.
of things. Could I ask very quickly too about this, like dystonia type and these disintegrating things? Parkinson be one, but there are these terrible wastings like ALS and so on
so
too.
dystonia is another
Yes.
disease that's probably affects the basal ganglia. It's probably because we cannot really finely control different groups of muscles in a fun way, so we have a co-contraction or unwanted movements. But what's so complicated about these areas are not only motor, there are also perceptual areas, because you have also, we always have a knowledge of where our limb is,
Yes.
because you have to have the kinesthetic knowledge about
Yes.
where our limb are, or proprioceptive information, which gives us feedback about where our arms in space or whatever. And this information is also affected in diseases like Parkinson or in dystonia. So that's one of the things we are trying to figure out, how it is affecting both
The
sensation
perception
of
and
movement and the
yes.
production of movement.
I see. Okay. Do you have any like projections with this? Do you feel pretty optimistic that there will be? This sounds significant. What you've mentioned, you know, with bringing back some motion and.
Well, it is a very hard problem, and there are certain areas, like for instance in Parkinson, certainly the combination of drugs and electrical stimulation in certain areas has been quite effective. It's not it's not a cure.
Right,
it's not a cure.
yeah,
The disease
right.
remains.
Yes.
But there is compensation, and so life becomes much more acceptable. For Parkinson, there are certain other diseases multiple sclerosis, which again, multiple sclerosis in the last few years, a lot of progress has been made in preventing the development of the disease.
Oh, I
So
see.
that's very important.
Yeah.
So the disease is still there,
Right.
but it's slowed down,
Right.
or
Controlled.
or stopped, which is
Yes.
great.
Right.
Yeah. In the case of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig disease,
Yes.
unfortunately, is
Yeah.
gigantic problems there.
Yeah.
It's very hard to understand what's going on, but it's a depressing picture.
Yes.
And head injuries and stroke, of course, we have. I already said, you know, that where we are, and am I optimistic? Well, it's a hard problem, but progress has been made and will continue to be made.
Right.
Because knowledge is of the brain is coming. It's not coming as fast as we would like to. There is a lot of knowledge at the basic biological level,
Yeah.
the cells, the connectivity,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
synapses, and so forth. So, at the level of the integrated behavior,
Yes, system,
that is
yeah.
system. That's more
Right.
complicated, of course,
Right.
and the progress is slower, but nevertheless, there is progress.
Yes. You know, you're aware that there has been considerable alarm in this country about especially young people with soccer and football and a lot of head injuries. So it started out with boxing that people began to see with aging boxers, real damage that was never necessary, and now we're seeing it with soccer, what we call soccer. Do you think that it's correct to be concerned about this? Is there to avoid this, or do you think that kids will mend a little better if they're?
Well, I'm not an expert on this problem, but I would say that the answer, one way or the other, is not yet there.
Mm-hmm.
And remains to be seen. A lot of more recordings have to be done, more careful assessment of brain function in the youngster.
And head trauma generally, I guess.
Head trauma. Certainly, head trauma it's not a particularly healthy thing to do.
Absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
But remains to be seen
Right.
whether
It was a question of whether
Yeah.
young kids are more resilient in that respect, you know, than, say, boxers do this as adults and so on.
And also the
then just
traumatic
continue.
impact of boxing
Exactly,
is much
exactly. But there is you can really sense the change in attitude
Yes.
about this and more
Yeah.
concern,
Yeah.
whereas the more aggression, the better, it seemed like for a
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah.
But that's all changing. Well, this is, so rehabilitation looks like they're moving along in a number of areas, but there's still basic stuff to learn, right?
Absolutely.
And how about robotics in that case? It's really come along, but there's an area where they realize that movement is difficult.
So there is a lot of research and work in recent years in all areas of robotics, including in the area of humanoid robots, where at least the structure of the body of the robot is inspired and
Yeah.
mimics the structure of the human body, and that's where research of the type we are doing, that studying the human movement, we can apply or is applied to some of the movements of the humanoid robots.
I see.
There's another kind of research which is more in biorobotics, where you also are inspired by other kind of animals, but not necessarily only by human movements.
Right.
For example, one of topic we have been studied for many years is the topic of how, for example, we move flexible arms,
Yes.
like the arm, for
And
example,
a whole bunch of them.
for the octopus, for
Yes.
example. So if we show what the octopus is capable,
Look at that.
it's capable of very smooth movements,
Yeah.
okay, where it can reach with two arms or one arm some object in space.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about the octopus is that it totally lacks bones. There are no bones in the arm, so it's only made of muscles. And so the commands to the muscle are in such a way that you can move the arm very smoothly and continuously, and you can do fascinating thing, because the octopus is one of the more intelligent
Right.
creature among the invertebrates.
Right.
So there have been a lot of studies. We have been studying the Weizmann Institute together with the Hebrew University, Professor Hochner. We have been studying the octopus movement for a long time. And eventually, we can also use it to build robots, for example. Eventually, the inspiration comes from the biological motion, but we can also build flexible robotic arm. And what I want to show you is
You can build them.
one
Yeah.
can build and develop a robotic arm that is inspired by the biology and can imitate the structure of biological arms. And there is a real effort in recent years to build a robotic arm that looks like the octopus, that moves smoothly in the water and can operate underwater, in the sea, and outside of the sea with flexible arms. And so you can use this kind of robot to reach, in case of saving people underwater,
right.
or
To do very complex maneuvers.
with
Yes.
kind of flexible arm. This
Right.
particular arm, which you'll show later, was developed by the Robotic Institute in Pisa, in the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and there is really advancement in this field. So this is the field that will be moving in the future, really mimicking the biology and in the biorobotics direction.
Yeah. Do the same principles obtain even though you're dealing with a limb that doesn't have bone in it? Do you, in other words, between this brain muscle thing and synergies, are we talking about similar kinds of
So actually,
instructions?
the research has shown that, very interestingly, that unlike in humans, when we have a map of the body and the different muscles, in the octopus, there is different kind of control strategies. We are not sure yet, and how there is not really a somatotopic map where you have different body parts represented by areas close to each other.
Right.
So the question how in octopus we have evolved different kind of muscular maps is a very intriguing one.
Yes. That is interesting because they're pretty good at what they do.
Yes,
but I can see the advantage in robotics where remember as they were developing robots to walk, that walking was impossible, and movement and grasping. I think it was all very difficult.
Well, it is. There are huge advancements, but I wouldn't say that they are as articulated as we are, or are as flexible and versatile as
they
we
are now?
Aren't yet.
Not yet. Okay,
So
good. We're relieved to hear about that.
Right.
So
but, but it's going to come.
yes, so they
yeah.
say, you know, and they'll, but you do see tremendous, I can't remember the one that the Japanese developed that's
There's
very
the Honda
humanoid.
robot.
Yes,
But-
exactly.
But there's
it's-
there is a huge progress, of course, in the many laboratories in
right.
the world, the entire world, including the United States, Japan, Korea,
Yeah, right, all over the
Europe.
world. Right,
are working
but
on robotic
it
systems.
makes you so aware of how complicated motion is that you'd think, well, you just wind that thing up and
That's
let
right.
it go, but that's not the way it works at all. So with that, I have to come back to the octopus for just a moment. Are there any particular applications that you are thinking for that? You mentioned it can be the structure of this robot. I mean, it can work in or out of water. That's not an issue, but there would be many advantages because of its great flexibility if that can be emulated.
It can be used for endoscope,
Yeah.
for surgery within the body, within arteries, or the colons or whatever.
Yes.
So the development can come, or
Yeah.
are based and inspired by the biology.
Right, right. You both worked on many things. What really gets you up in the morning to run to the office and?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I try to understand what is the relationship between the cortical areas that have predominantly to do with the expression of the intention of movement and learning, and then how this translates into the command to the spinal cord to do this or that. That is I feel that we just scratched the surface of these problems, and that's what I'm interested in.
Yes. On that, it's, you know how in many areas you understand a system by taking it apart bit by bit by bit, and yet there are many systems that operate on the basis of complexity. You don't arrive at it until the whole thing is there. Do you know what I mean? An emergent kind of property.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of interest in that now. Do you consider that that is a part of this work, that will come to that it will be understanding that is, we have to get at it in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, for each of these problems that I mentioned, there is an ideal model system. And some of the model system imply that you have to either suppress or knock out a particular type of a particular circuit. But that can be done now with this new technology of whereby you can insert into a particular circuit, that is into the particular type of cells that make up a circuit, you can insert what is called channel rhodopsin. That is a channel that goes into the membrane of each of the cells of the same type of cells, and then this can be activated or deactivated by light, okay, by shining light at a particular frequency. And that is a technology that essentially can, where you can sort of unplug or plug or excite a particular circuit, and that is a way to reduce the complexity of the problem and study a particular segment, and without necessarily doing a surgical intervention or doing something. So that is a very
clever,
very powerful technique that has just come a few years ago, has been developed and is being used in many laboratories, including my own.
Yes, and I'm sure that that's going to take you some distance. And
that's
how
a hope.
about you? What's your very favorite thing?
One favorite thing of mine is more theoretical in recent years, and has been to do with the question of time.
Yes.
So we know that there is perception of the world in vision and other modalities. There is action. So but we would like to look for a common language both for perception and action. And also we know that time is very important in all these kind of activities. So one favorite direction for myself is, or my group or my research is, how is time representing the brain within networks of neurons that are distributed all over the brain, and what's the relationship between space and time, which is a very old philosophical question.
Yes, but I had never heard it. I heard your talk a while back, and I was really taken with this, that this time is emergent from this geometry, and that is very interesting.
And then we would like to go back from a more modeling approaches, theoretical, back to the circuitry of the brain, and see how it's implemented in different parts of the brain, or how it's mapped to muscle synergies, or how it's working within the circuitry. So that's my favorite.
Yes. Well, you're both going to be busy for a few years, aren't you? But in any case, it's a very exciting era to be alive and to be, watching your progress in this.
And thanks for inviting us.
Oh, thank you
very much.
Thanks.
Right. And we'll say thank you, and then we'll let the audience talk to you and ask any questions here. Would you all like anybody?
This is just, I was really fascinated by one of the first slides where you show the sparse connectivity of, the things going through the brain, the eyes, the brain, and then into your spinal column. And then you show the one to the far right, which was really optimized. That is, your paths just take the most direct and effective movement. And one of the things I was thinking about, as probably a good analogy, is you get a little baby that he first sees his mother spooning food into his mouth, and the baby grabs the spoon eventually, and he's, to him it's just a little toy. And then eventually he starts with very cumbersome movements. He tries to balance, and if he even gets one little chunk in his mouth, he's ecstatic.
Exactly.
And then eventually he learns that you don't grab it like this, you grab it like this, and not only do you grab it, you have to balance it so that 90% of what's in your spoon, but to make that happen is pretty incredible.
It's and it's learning.
Yeah,
it's learned.
It's a good example of where it all starts.
So, Dr. Bizzi, when you were mentioning how people who had had a stroke could slowly recover, I was wondering if the muscles had been used to, before the stroke, if the muscles had been used to doing a really wide range of movements, would it be easier to recover?
I see what you're saying, that a highly practiced movement, do they recover faster than movements that have
hardly been used or something?
Not been used? I don't think so. I think that what really matters is the area that has been destroyed and the amount of destruction. And that is the major factor, and will affect muscles that have been used every day, or muscles that used a bit less, and so it's where the damage has been provoked.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Is there any evidence that some people were sort of born pre-wired to be better at particular motions, athletes or musicians?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. What defines a klutz? And what's the difference between a klutz and somebody who is naturally endowed? Well, I don't know the answer, but my guess is that when the brain develops, there is competition between the areas, And in some instances, certain areas are somehow manage to develop more than others. And this explains why somebody is particularly gifted in one area and not in other areas and so on. And I think that given the complexity and the enormous distribution of all the motor system, you know, I talked a lot about the cortex, but there are these subcortical areas, there is a cerebellum, there is spinal cord, and so on. So if something goes wrong in one of these areas, then you do have a problem. And in the athlete that moves perfectly, learns perfectly, fast, well, you have somebody that is lucky to have his system perfectly tuned in every part. That's a guess, yeah.
I think this.
You talked about geometry and movement. Are there other areas of math that are used, like does the brain process numbers in a certain way that can help initiate movement, or is there, or is it?
Is there, excuse me, there,
is there a way that the brain processes movement mathematically besides geometry? Are there?
Geometry is not that we actually, the geometry is a tool for us as researchers to describe the representation of the information. It's not that the brain does geometry, because we don't know how it's doing geometry. We also don't know exactly how it's doing number addition and calculation. But what we have been learning in recent years, there are very strong similarities between the way we represent space, time, and number. So for example, we have larger things on the left, for example, and smaller things on the right. Also larger number on the left and smaller number on the right. There are very strong similarities in the way we represent all these quantities. So this is really a deep question, but how the brain represents numbers or calculation, but the brain has its own way of doing things, not necessarily what we are doing in mathematics. But exactly that's the basis for asking question how the brain thinks. Whether we think about movement or we think about space or we think about geometry, do we have a different kind of calculation or do we have the same language for the brain to do all these cognitive tasks? So I don't have the answer, but this is certainly a very interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks.
It was very interesting to hear. Thank you.